A woman's face was smashed in after she was already dead. Not by grave robbers hunting for gold, not by accident, not by the slow decay of 3,000 years underground. Someone stood over her corpse in the private chambers of a doomed royal family, raised a heavy object and destroyed her jaw, her mouth, her cheek, with deliberate, furious precision. Then they hid her body, stripped of every royal title, in a cramped side room of someone else's tomb, and let history forget her name. For more than a century, nobody knew who she was. When scientists finally forced her bones to speak, the answer she gave them didn't just solve a murder mystery. It exposed the biological unraveling of the most powerful family on Earth. A slow-motion catastrophe that had been hiding in plain sight inside the most famous tomb ever discovered. In 1898, the French Egyptologist Victor Loret was excavating in the Valley of the Kings when he broke into the tomb known today as KV-35, the resting place of Pharaoh Amenhotep II. The main burial chamber was impressive, decorated and intact, exactly what a 19th century archaeologist hoped to find. But in a small side chamber, sealed off from the ceremonial rooms, Loret found something that looked less like a royal burial and more like a crime scene. 3 unwrapped bodies lay on the bare stone floor. No coffins, no linen wrappings, no jewelry, no funerary texts, no name plaques identifying who they were. Someone had hidden them there in a hurry, stripped of the rituals that Egyptians believed were essential for surviving into the afterlife. One body belonged to an older woman with long, dark, wavy hair, later nicknamed the Elder Lady. Beside her lay the body of a boy, roughly 10 years old, with the shaved head and single-side lock of hair typical of young Egyptian royalty. The third body, wedged into the same forgotten room, became one of the most haunting unsolved mysteries in Egyptology. Researchers would come to call her simply the Younger Lady. What had been done to her went far beyond the usual damage inflicted by ancient tomb robbers searching for hidden amulets. Her left arm had been snapped off. Her chest had been caved in with considerable force. But the injury that stood out, the one that generations of scientists could not stop asking about, was to her face. The lower jaw and mouth had been shattered by a heavy, blunt strike, leaving a gaping wound where her lips, teeth, and cheek had once been. For decades, the standard explanation was theft. Ancient robbers were known to pry open mummies' mouths, looking for gold amulets tucked between the teeth or under the tongue. It was a plausible story, and for a long time, nobody questioned it. The tomb itself had already been plundered in antiquity, so the presence of ransacked, undressed bodies wasn't in itself surprising. Amenhotep II's own burial chamber had been broken into and looted more than once before modern archaeologists arrived, and later priests had even used the tomb as a secret cache to protect other royal mummies, moved there for safekeeping during periods of unrest. Against that backdrop, 3 stripped, damaged bodies in a side chamber looked, at first glance, like just another chapter in a long history of grave robbery. Then, in the 21st century, forensic radiologists ran detailed CT scans on the Younger Lady's remains and found a detail that theft could not explain. The fracture patterns showed that the blow to her face had happened either at the moment of death or during the very earliest stages of mummification, while her tissue was still soft and pliable, not centuries later at the hands of opportunistic looters. This was not vandalism committed long after the fact. Someone close to the moment of her death had deliberately destroyed her face. To understand why that mattered so much, you have to understand what ancient Egyptians believed a face actually was. Preserving the body was not a formality or a gesture of respect. It was considered the literal precondition for eternal life. Egyptians believed the soul needed to recognize its own physical form in order to return to it and live forever in the next world. Destroying someone's face was not simply an act of violence against a corpse. It was an attempt to erase that person from existence altogether, to make sure the gods could never recognize her, and to make sure future generations would never remember her name. In the belief system of the time, this was very possibly the single worst thing you could do to another human being. Worse than killing them, because it threatened to unmake their soul. That raises an obvious and unsettling question. Who was this woman that someone hated her enough to try to erase her from eternity itself, and yet who was also important enough that somebody else risked their own safety to smuggle her ruined body into a royal hiding place rather than let her be thrown away entirely? She had been placed among genuine members of the royal family. That alone told researchers she had not been some minor palace servant caught up in an unrelated crime. She belonged, by all appearances, to the innermost circle of Egypt's most powerful dynasty, the 18th dynasty, the family that produced some of the most famous rulers in human history. For much of the 20th century, the leading theory, the one that captured public imagination more than any other, was that the Younger Lady might be Nefertiti herself, the queen whose serene limestone bust sits behind glass in Berlin's Neues Museum, instantly recognizable, endlessly reproduced, treated as the ancient world's definition of beauty. Was it possible that behind that idealized portrait, the real woman had met a violent, anonymous end, her body smashed and discarded in a hidden chamber, her name deliberately stolen from history? To settle the question once and for all, an Egyptian and international team of researchers, led by Zahi Hawass and published in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 2010, did something that had never been attempted on this scale before. They extracted genetic material directly from the bones of the royal mummies, including bone fragments from the younger lady's shattered jaw, and ran a full genetic kinship analysis. For decades, most scientists assumed this was simply impossible. Egypt's hot climate, the harsh natron salts used in mummification, and 3,000 years of time were all expected to have destroyed any usable DNA. Advances in ancient DNA extraction proved that assumption wrong, at least partially, though the fragility of the material meant every result would later be scrutinized and debated by outside experts. The researchers compared genetic markers, short repeating sequences of DNA that function like a genetic fingerprint, across 11 royal mummies, alongside a control group of 5 older mummies, used to check the reliability of the extraction process itself. Each person inherits one copy of each marker from their mother and one from their father, so comparing these markers across bodies allowed the team to reconstruct family relationships with a level of precision no historical text could offer. To guard against contamination, a serious risk when working with genetic material this old and this fragile, the team ran every sample twice, in 2 entirely separate laboratories staffed by different researchers, and only accepted a result once both labs produced matching profiles. It was, by the standards of the field at the time, an unusually rigorous approach to a notoriously difficult category of evidence, though, as we'll see, rigor and method did not put an end to disagreement over interpretation. They started with 2 mummies, whose identities were already well established, Amenhotep III and his powerful queen, Tiye. Their known son was the religious revolutionary Pharaoh Akhenaten, the ruler who briefly overturned Egypt's traditional religion in favor of worshipping a single sun disk, the Aten. The genetic data for the mummy believed to be Akhenaten matched what would be expected of their son, consistent with, though not universally accepted by every scholar as definitive proof of that identification. Then came the younger lady. When her genetic profile was compared against Amenhotep III and Tiye, the markers were consistent with her being their daughter, and therefore the full sister of Akhenaten. That single result reshaped the entire investigation. This anonymous, mutilated woman appeared to have been a full-blooded royal princess, sister to one of the most consequential pharaohs in Egyptian history, and it immediately ruled out the theory that had fascinated the public for so long. Nefertiti was not, by any surviving historical record, a daughter of Amenhotep III and Tiye. She came from a separate line, likely connected to the influential courtier Ai, but not from the immediate royal nuclear family. Whoever the younger lady was, the evidence indicated she could not be Nefertiti. The next comparison delivered an even more startling result. Researchers matched the genetic profile of the man believed to be Akhenaten and the younger lady against the mummy of history's most famous pharaoh, Tutankhamun. The data was consistent with those 2 mummies being his biological father and mother, not his stepmother, not a minor secondary wife. His mother and father were, according to this analysis, full siblings. This is where the story stops being a simple detective mystery and becomes something closer to a slow-building tragedy, one rooted not in curses or conspiracies, but in basic biology. It's worth pausing here to be clear about where the science stands, because this finding has not gone unchallenged. Some geneticists and Egyptologists, including the French scholar Marc Gabolde, have argued the degraded state of 3,000-year-old DNA, combined with generations of prior royal intermarriage in this family, could produce genetic patterns that mimic a full sibling relationship, even if the actual relationship was closer to first cousins. Under that reading, Tutankhamun's parents might still have been closely related, just not necessarily brother and sister in the strictest sense. The identity of the younger lady herself also remains genuinely debated. Some researchers, including Hawass, have proposed she may have been a woman named Bekhetaten, another daughter of Amenhotep III and Tiye, while other specialists argue the degraded DNA in the family's already tangled inbreeding could just as easily point to a granddaughter rather than a daughter. What is not seriously disputed across the competing interpretations is the broader picture the CT scans and genetic testing painted together, that Tutankhamun's lineage was the product of repeated close-kin unions, and that this had visible, lasting consequences for his body. To understand why the royal family kept marrying so closely within itself, you have to understand how they saw themselves. Egyptian pharaohs did not think of themselves as ordinary rulers governing ordinary people. They believed they were living gods on earth, and gods, in their theology, did not mix their sacred bloodline with people of lesser standing. Egyptian mythology reinforced this directly. The god Osiris was married to his own sister, Isis, and their union was treated as a sacred model, not a scandal. By echoing that divine marriage, pharaohs believed they were concentrating divine power in their descendants, keeping the bloodline pure and keeping the throne and the empire's staggering wealth locked safely within one small family circle, rather than dispersed through marriage alliances with outside nobility. The problem is that biology has no interest in mythology. Every person inherits 2 copies of most genes, one from each parent. In a large, genetically diverse population, harmful recessive mutations are usually masked, because the odds of 2 unrelated people carrying the exact same rare defective gene are extremely low. Close relatives, though, are far more likely to carry identical hidden mutations inherited from a shared ancestor. When relatives have children together, the chance that a child will inherit 2 broken copies of the same gene, one from each parent, rises sharply. Generation after generation of sibling and near-sibling marriages inside the 18th dynasty did not purify the royal bloodline the way its architects believed it would. It concentrated genetic defects instead, compounding with each new generation like a debt-collecting interest. Tutankhamun inherited that debt in full. Official artwork from his reign shows exactly what royal propaganda wanted the public to see: a strong, athletic king riding a war chariot at full gallop, firing arrows at Egypt's enemies with effortless confidence. Modern CT scans and radiological studies of his mummy tell a strikingly different story. Tutankhamun was a chronically ill, physically fragile young man, and the list of documented conditions reads more like a medical chart than a portrait of a warrior god. He was born with a cleft palate. He suffered from severe clubfoot, medically known as talipes equinovarus, in his left foot. Bone tissue in his left foot showed signs of Köhler disease, a form of a vascular necrosis in which bone dies from lack of blood supply, which would have made every step genuinely painful. Because of this combination of deformities, one leg was measurably shorter than the other, and he likely could not stand unaided for long without support. When Howard Carter's team cataloged the contents of Tutankhamun's tomb in the 1920s, alongside the gold and the famous burial mask, they found something that historians initially dismissed as purely ceremonial: well over 100 canes and walking sticks. For decades, these were treated as symbols of royal authority, the kind of ornamental staff any pharaoh might be depicted holding. Later, closer examination revealed clear wear marks on the tips of many of them, the kind of wear that comes from genuine, repeated, weight-bearing use. These weren't just symbols of power. For a young man who could barely walk without assistance, they were medical equipment, disguised in gold and ivory to protect the image of a living god. Revealed clear wear marks on the tips of many of them, the kind of wear that comes from genuine, repeated, weight-bearing use. These weren't just symbols of power. For a young man who could barely walk without assistance, they were medical equipment, disguised in gold and ivory to protect the image of a living god. The skeletal damage was only part of the picture. Deep inbreeding doesn't just concentrate visible physical defects, it can also weaken immune function, leaving a body less able to fight off disease. Tissue analysis of Tutankhamun's remains found genetic traces of the parasite that causes malaria, specifically the most dangerous species, Plasmodium falciparum, and evidence suggests he experienced multiple severe malarial infections during his short life. On top of everything else, his body was already struggling to manage. A young king who could not walk without a cane, whose immune system was compromised, and who was repeatedly weakened by malarial fever, was, by any modern medical standard, a chronically sick A. There has been debate among researchers about exactly what ultimately killed him. Early theories, fueled by an old X-ray showing a dense spot inside his skull, suggested he may have been murdered by a blow to the head, a theory that made for dramatic headlines for decades. Later, far more detailed CT scanning in 2005 largely put that idea to rest, showing that the skull damage was almost certainly caused during the mummification process itself, not by a fatal wound. What the more recent evidence points to instead is a fracture to his left thigh, sustained shortly before death, possibly from a fall his weakened leg made him prone to, that combined with a parasitic infection already circulating in his blood may have proven fatal to a body with so little physical reserve left to draw on. It's a far less cinematic explanation than a palace assassination, but a far more medically coherent one, and it fits the broader pattern the DNA and skeletal evidence had already revealed. A young man whose body had been failing him gradually for years before it finally gave out entirely. And yet, despite all of this, the machinery of the Egyptian state still expected one thing above everything else from its young pharaoh: an heir. The throne's legitimacy, the loyalty of the priesthood, the stability of the entire kingdom rested on Tutankhamun producing a healthy successor. To fulfill that responsibility, he married Ankhesenamun, a young woman of unquestionably pure royal blood, the daughter of Akhenaten and his chief queen Nefertiti. On the surface, this looked like an ordinary political marriage designed to reinforce his claim to the throne. Beneath the surface, it sealed the family's fate. because Ankhesenamen's father was Akhenaten, and if Tutankhamun's father was also Akhenaten, that made Ankhesenamen and Tutankhamun half-siblings, or at the very least extremely close relatives, continuing a pattern of intermarriage the family had been locked into for generations. The genetic burden that had already produced a chronically disabled king now had almost no fresh, unrelated genetic material to dilute it. What court propaganda called a sacred union of divine blood was, in blunt biological terms, a further concentration of the same inherited defects, generation after generation, with no healthy new genes entering the pool to counterbalance them. When Howard Carter broke through the sealed doorway into Tutankhamun's tomb in November 1922, the world's attention fixed almost entirely on the gold. The chariots, the golden shrines, the alabaster vessels, and eventually the solid gold burial mask that remains one of the most recognized artifacts on the planet. Almost lost amid that spectacle was a small plain wooden box discovered in a side room archaeologists named the Treasury. Inside were 2 miniature coffins, each carefully wrapped and coated in black resin, prepared with the same ritual care given to a full-grown pharaoh. Inside those tiny coffins were the mummified remains of 2 infant girls. Later analysis determined that the first fetus died at around 5 to 6 months of gestation. Her development halted before she could have survived outside the womb. The second was carried nearly to full term but was stillborn. CT imaging conducted decades later found she had significant congenital abnormalities of the spine and skull, including spina bifida, conditions consistent with severe developmental defects that would not have been survivable. DNA testing has linked these 2 mummified fetuses to Tutankhamun and most likely to Ankhesenamen, making them his own daughters, the final and most heartbreaking casualties of a genetic collapse generations in the making. There would be no living heir. The bloodline that had spent generations marrying within itself to preserve its own perceived purity ended not in triumph, but in 2 small wooden coffins tucked away in a treasury room, overshadowed by gold. With no surviving royal children and Tutankhamun himself dead by around 19 years old, the very dynasty that had staked its identity on divine, unbroken bloodline had run out of eligible successors carrying that bloodline. Power did not pass smoothly to a son. It passed, in the chaotic years that followed, first through a series of transitional figures, and eventually out of the family line entirely, ending the 18th dynasty's direct succession for good. This is also where Nefertiti's own story becomes far more complicated and far more consequential than her famous bust suggests. That serene, painted limestone portrait in Berlin has done her something of a disservice, freezing her in the public imagination as a passive symbol of beauty rather than a political actor. Textual and archaeological evidence from late in Akhenaten's reign points to a woman who held genuine executive power. Some surviving relief carvings show a figure using regalia and gestures traditionally reserved for a pharaoh, striking enemies in the classic pose of a ruling king rather than a consort. A substantial number of Egyptologists now believe that after Akhenaten's death, Nefertiti did not quietly disappear from public life. Instead, the evidence suggests she may have adopted a new royal name, Neferuaten, and ruled Egypt in her own right as a female pharaoh, at least for a time, during one of the most unstable and precarious periods the kingdom had faced in over a century. This remains a subject of active scholarly debate rather than settled certainty, but it is taken seriously by a meaningful portion of the field, not dismissed as fringe speculation. If that reconstruction is accurate, Nefertiti was not a bystander to her family's genetic collapse. She was managing an empire in crisis, trying to hold together religious upheaval, economic strain, and a royal succession crisis, all while the men closest to the throne were being physically and reproductively devastated by generations of inbreeding they didn't understand and couldn't have prevented, because the underlying genetics of recessive inheritance would not be understood by any human being for another 3,000 years. For a while, it also seemed possible that Nefertiti's own burial place might be hiding in plain sight, astonishingly close to Tutankhamun himself. In 2015, British Egyptologist Nicholas Reeves examined high-resolution scans of the painted walls in Tutankhamun's burial chamber and identified what he believed were faint traces of 2 sealed, plastered-over doorways. His theory was dramatic. Tutankhamun's own tomb seemed unusually small and cramped for a king, almost as though it had been built for someone of lesser status and hastily adapted after his sudden, unexpected death. Reeves proposed that Tutankhamun might have been buried in what was originally an outer corridor of a larger tomb, one that was still in use, possibly belonging to Nefertiti herself. Initial radar scans in November 2015 seemed to support the idea, and Egypt's antiquities minister at the time publicly stated he was 90% confident a hidden chamber existed behind the tomb's north wall. It was an electrifying possibility that the missing queen might be lying just a few feet away from the world's most famous archaeological discovery, sealed behind painted plaster for over 3,000 years. But subsequent More rigorous investigations told a different story. A second scan in 2016 produced results that contradicted the first. A third and far more comprehensive survey, conducted by geophysicists from the University of Turin using more advanced ground-penetrating radar equipment, was completed in 2018. Egypt's Ministry of Antiquities announced the final conclusion that year, stating clearly that the data did not support the existence of any hidden chambers or corridors adjacent to Tutankhamun's tomb. As of the most recent word from Egyptian authorities, the search for a secret chamber behind Tutankhamun's tomb has been closed. It's an important correction to keep in mind, because the hidden doorway theory still circulates widely online as though it were an open, unresolved mystery. The science, at least for now, says otherwise. Nefertiti's final resting place remains genuinely unknown. What the DNA evidence, the CT scans, and the archaeological record do make clear, even amid the genuine scholarly disagreements over exact identities and precise degrees of relation, is a consistent underlying picture. This was a family that believed marrying within itself would make them stronger, purer, closer to the gods they claimed to be. Instead, across roughly a century and several generations, that same practice concentrated. Hidden genetic defects until they became visible in bone deformities, chronic illness, a fragile immune system, and ultimately in 2 small coffins that never should have needed to be made. The golden mask that tourists travel across the world to see in the Cairo Museum, sitting above one of history's most recognizable faces, sits above a body that could barely walk on its own. Behind the dazzling wealth and the god-king imagery was a lineage that had, quite literally, run out of healthy blood to give it. It's worth remembering, too, that Tutankhamun's tomb survived largely intact precisely because it was small and easy to overlook. Larger, more prominent royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings were stripped by robbers within decades or centuries of burial, their gold melted down and their names chiseled off monuments by later rulers who wanted to erase the Amarna period from memory altogether. Tutankhamun's obscurity, the very thing that meant so few later Egyptians thought to plunder his resting place, is the reason his mask, his coffins, and his broken little body survived at all for modern scientists to study. In a strange way, the same erasure that was meant to punish this family for its failed religious experiment is what preserved the evidence that eventually let us understand what happened to them. None of this makes the wonder of what was found in that tomb any smaller. If anything, it adds a layer of human tragedy underneath the gold, a reminder that even a family convinced of its own divinity was still bound, in the end, by the same unforgiving rules of biology that govern every living thing. The face that was smashed in that hidden room in KV-35 belonged to a woman whose name we may never fully agree on, but whose blood, according to the leading scientific evidence, ran through the veins of the most famous pharaoh who ever lived, and whose fate was tied to a family secret. It took 33 centuries and the tools of modern genetics to finally begin to uncover. If you found this story as fascinating as we did, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive into the secrets buried by history. And let us know in the comments which ancient mystery you want us to investigate next. And if you're still hungry for more, check out the video on your screen right now for another story the history books left out.